Chapter 1. Subtle Cracks. Lydia Ashford sat by the bay window, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup in slow, thoughtful circles. The late afternoon sun filtered through the sheer curtains, casting golden shadows across the neatly arranged living room. The house was quiet, as it often was at this time of day, the perfect reflection of her suburban life. From the outside, everything about her world seemed perfect: an enviable house on a quiet street, a charming and successful husband, and all the comforts a woman could desire. Yet despite the picture-perfect facade, Lydia's instincts whispered that something was terribly wrong. For months now she had sensed an unease creeping into the corners of her life, like a shadow growing longer as the day progressed. It was subtle at first, just a feeling, a small crack in the polished exterior of her marriage. Marcus, her husband of 15 years, had always been a busy man. His work in corporate finance demanded long hours, but they had always made time for each other. He used to call during the day just to check in, send her little messages that reminded her she was on his mind. But those gestures had faded. And then there were the excuses, the late-night meetings that never used to happen, hushed phone conversations that ended abruptly whenever she entered the room. When she asked, he was quick with explanations, always work-related, always logical. But Lydia was no fool. His sudden and inexplicable attention to his appearance, new cologne, sharper suits, haircuts that were just a bit more frequent, felt like a signal, as if he were preparing for someone else's eyes. Her hands tightened around the cup as her mind replayed the memories, each one another thread in the growing web of suspicion. Marcus had become distant, distracted. At first, Lydia had tried to rationalize it, blaming it on stress, the demands of his career, but the signs were too frequent now to ignore. He'd started leaving early in the mornings and coming home late at night, brushing her off when she asked him how his day had gone. He'd smile, that practiced, easy grin of his, and tell her he was exhausted from all the meetings. Sometimes he wouldn't even meet her eyes. The distance between them was palpable, a rift that had widened over the months until Lydia found herself sitting alone in the evenings, wondering where her husband really was. Her intuition, sharpened over the years, gnawed at her. Something was wrong, deeply wrong, but she couldn't prove it. At least, not yet. She had to be patient, she told herself. If Marcus was hiding something, he would eventually slip. And then, she would have the answers she needed. It was on a crisp autumn afternoon, just like this one, when Lydia found the first undeniable piece of evidence. She had spent the day running errands, trying to distract herself from the growing tension that filled their home. The air was brisk and cool, the leaves turning shades of amber and gold. It was a perfect fall day, but Lydia's mind was clouded with unease. Back home, she began tidying up, the mundane tasks of the household giving her some semblance of control. She moved from room to room, organizing, folding, straightening. She made her way into the laundry room, where a pile of Marcus's clothes from his recent business trip lay crumpled in the corner. With a sigh, she began sorting them into the washing machine. And then, she saw it. At first glance, it seemed like just another shirt. But as Lydia unfolded the fabric, her eyes fell on a small, glaring detail that stopped her cold. There, on the collar of Marcus's crisp white dress shirt, was a bright red lipstick stain. Her heart stilled, a rush of coldness spreading through her chest. Lydia never wore red lipstick. The shade was vivid, unmistakable. She stood frozen for a moment, her fingers gripping the shirt as her mind raced. The air felt heavy, thick with the weight of realization. This was it, the first tangible proof that Marcus had strayed, that the cracks in their marriage were deeper than she had imagined. Her mind reeled with questions. Who was she? How long had it been going on? Was this a one-time mistake? Or had it been happening for months, maybe even years? Her first instinct was to confront him. She could already see herself standing in front of Marcus, shirt in hand, demanding answers. The image fueled the anger that bubbled up inside her. But just as quickly as it had surged, Lydia forced herself to calm down. Acting on impulse wouldn't help her now. She needed to be smart. With a slow, deliberate breath, she refolded the shirt and placed it back in the hamper, hiding the evidence among the other clothes. She walked out of the laundry room and sat down on the kitchen stool, her mind spinning. Confronting him without more proof would only give him time to cover his tracks, to lie, and to manipulate the situation. No. Lydia had to wait. She had to gather more evidence, understand the full extent of what he had done. Only then would she confront him. The anger that simmered beneath her calm exterior settled into a cold determination. If Marcus was cheating on her, there would be more evidence. He would make more mistakes, leave more clues behind. She would watch, wait, and gather every last piece of the puzzle before making her move. Her thoughts began to swirl with possibilities. Who was this other woman? What kind of life had Marcus built with her behind Lydia's back? Was it serious, or was she just a fling? And most importantly, how would Lydia ensure that when the time came, she would be the one with the upper hand? A slow, calculated smile tugged at the corner of her lips. If Marcus thought he could betray her and get away with it, he was sorely mistaken. This wasn't just about revenge. This was about power, about reclaiming what was rightfully hers. She stood up from the stool, feeling an odd sense of clarity wash over her. The waiting game had begun, and Lydia would make sure she played it to perfection. Chapter 2. Silent Observer. In the weeks that followed her discovery of the lipstick stain, Lydia Ashford transformed. On the surface, she remained the same composed, graceful wife she had always been. But behind the calm mask, her mind was sharp and calculating. She no longer wore the blindfold of trust. Instead, she became a silent observer in her own life, watching Marcus with a keen, almost predatory eye. Every moment they spent together was now filtered through the lens of suspicion. Lydia found herself studying him, scrutinizing every word, every gesture. She was patient, never pressing him for answers, never allowing herself to show the hurt or anger she felt. That was what Marcus expected, an emotional outburst, a tearful confrontation. But Lydia wasn't going to give him the satisfaction. She let him believe she was still in the dark, blissfully ignorant to the growing distance between them. But the truth was, Lydia noticed everything now. It began with his phone. Marcus had always been private with his work calls, but now it was different. He'd grown secretive, overly protective of his messages. Whenever she walked into the room, he'd flick his phone screen away, as if he were hiding something. The once familiar ping of incoming texts had become more frequent, and every time it happened, Marcus would shift in his seat, growing tense. Lydia watched as he glanced at his phone with barely concealed anticipation, his fingers moving quickly to type out responses before locking the screen and pocketing the device. He never shared the content of those messages, and when she casually asked who had been texting, his answers were vague, dismissive. "Just work," he'd mutter, without meeting her eyes. Lydia didn't press. She would nod, smile, and go about her day, but her mind would catalog the moment, adding it to the growing list of clues. The phone calls were the same. Marcus would step out of the room to take certain calls now, his voice low and hurried. Sometimes, when he didn't notice her approaching, she could hear snippets of conversation. They were hushed, filled with empty promises about seeing someone soon. The moment she entered the room, his words would cut off abruptly. He'd hang up quickly, offering some excuse about work crises or late-night meetings. But Lydia knew. She could see it in the way his face tightened, in the furtive glances he shot her way whenever she came too close. It was as if he was afraid she'd overhear something she shouldn't, something that would tear their carefully constructed life apart. Marcus had become more irritable too, more distant. He no longer asked her about her day, no longer lingered in their conversations. When she attempted to engage him, his responses were clipped, almost robotic. He always seemed to be in a hurry, distracted by something far more important than her. And whenever Lydia gently probed about his increasing time away from home, those late-night meetings that stretched into the early hours of the morning, he would sigh, the irritation clear in his voice. "Work's just been insane lately," he would say, massaging the back of his neck. "I'm under so much stress. Can't we just have a quiet night, Lydia?" The old Lydia might have been hurt, might have taken his distance personally, but the new Lydia was different. She was calculating, always thinking 2 steps ahead. She recognized his behavior for what it was: guilt, frustration, the signs of a man living 2 lives. But Marcus didn't know that she was no longer the trusting wife he once believed her to be. He had no idea that his every move was being catalogued, that Lydia was gathering pieces of his deception, slowly but surely building her case. The paper trail. It wasn't enough for Lydia to simply suspect an affair. She needed concrete proof, undeniable evidence that would make it impossible for Marcus to lie his way out of this. And so, she began tracking his every move. It started with the credit card statements. Marcus had always handled the finances, but Lydia knew enough about their spending patterns to spot something unusual. She began scanning the monthly statements with new eyes, looking for anything out of the ordinary. It didn't take long before she found it. There were charges for dinners at upscale restaurants, places Lydia had never been with him. Her eyes scanned the names of restaurants she didn't recognize, some in parts of the city they rarely visited. The amounts were high, far too extravagant for business meetings, and always for 2 people. There were spa treatments, too, luxurious packages she had never been treated to. And then there was the jewelry, a purchase made at an exclusive boutique, the kind of store Marcus knew Lydia had no interest in. He hadn't brought home any new gifts, so Lydia could only imagine who the recipient was. She quietly made copies of everything. Each transaction, every suspicious charge, was logged and filed away in a folder she had created for this purpose alone. She couldn't afford to miss anything. Every scrap of evidence was ammunition for the final confrontation, the moment when she would expose him for what he had done. Piecing together his lies. Lydia's silent observation went beyond just finances. She began to monitor his schedule, noting every time he claimed to be working late or going on yet another business trip. It became clear that these meetings and trips were nothing more than excuses to spend time with her, this other woman who had wormed her way into Lydia's marriage. She was methodical. For each night Marcus stayed out late, for each weekend he claimed to be away on business, Lydia quietly recorded the details. She made a mental map of his movements, cross-referencing his supposed work obligations with his spending habits. Everything started to form a pattern, and the web of lies became clearer with each passing day. There was a moment, late one night, when Marcus came home well past midnight, his eyes bloodshot, his shirt wrinkled, and reeking of a cologne that wasn't his usual brand. Lydia was waiting for him, sitting in the living room with a book in her lap. She glanced up as he stumbled through the door, feigning surprise. "You're home late," she said, her voice even. "Yeah," Marcus replied, dropping his keys on the table and avoiding her gaze. "Work ran longer than expected. You know how it is." Lydia nodded, her expression neutral. Of course. But inside she knew exactly where he had been. She could smell her scent on him, perfume, floral and musky, lingering faintly on his clothes. Her stomach churned, but she forced herself to remain calm. Marcus had no idea how closely she was watching him. He didn't know that she had already seen the receipts from the hotel where he had stayed with her, that she knew exactly where he had spent his evening. The silent resolve. Lydia could have confronted him then, could have thrown the accusations in his face, but that wasn't part of the plan. She couldn't afford to let her emotions take control. She was building something far greater than a simple argument. She was preparing for the moment when she would take everything from him in one calculated strike. So, she stayed silent. She smiled when she needed to, played the role of the loving wife when it suited her. But her heart was cold now, her mind focused solely on the end game. The more Marcus lied, the stronger her resolve became. Each deceit was another nail in the coffin, another step closer to his undoing. And he didn't even know it. As the weeks passed, Lydia became a master of deception herself. She no longer flinched when Marcus kissed her goodbye, no longer questioned his late nights or sudden absences. She had trained herself to maintain the illusion of ignorance, to let him believe that he had her fooled. But inside, Lydia was waiting, watching, calculating, and soon enough, the pieces of her revenge would fall into place. Chapter 3. The Plan. The day Lydia confirmed her suspicions, something fundamental within her shifted. The woman who had once been the devoted, doting wife ceased to exist. In her place emerged a woman who had been betrayed, yes, but one determined to exact a revenge so complete and devastating that Marcus would never see it coming. No longer content with simply confronting him, Lydia had a grander plan. She wasn't going to scream, accuse, or demand an explanation. No, Marcus didn't deserve the dignity of an argument. She was going to destroy him, methodically, meticulously, and permanently. Her revenge would be so perfectly calculated that when it hit, Marcus would find himself with nothing. The first step was ensuring her financial independence. For years, Lydia had been content to let Marcus handle their wealth, trusting him to manage the household finances while she worked as a freelance interior designer. She enjoyed her job, but had never been driven by money. That changed overnight. With cold precision, Lydia began taking on more projects. She sought out higher-end clients, those willing to pay top dollar for her work. Word spread quickly about her talents, and soon she had a steady stream of clients. Late nights spent poring over design plans, making sure every detail was perfect, began to pay off. But it wasn't just about earning more money. Lydia needed a safety net, something Marcus couldn't touch. She set up a trust under a different name, separate from any joint accounts they shared. Every extra penny she earned went into that trust. Quietly and without fanfare, she started buying small properties, fixer-uppers she could flip for a profit, investments Marcus knew nothing about. Her portfolio grew steadily, and with it, her confidence. This was just the beginning. Building her arsenal, gathering financial independence was only the first step. To truly ruin Marcus, she needed more than just money. She needed evidence, irrefutable proof of his betrayal, and that required professional help. Lydia reached out to a private investigator, a man who came highly recommended for his discretion and efficiency. She met with him at a cafe 2 towns over, far from prying eyes, explaining her situation with measured calm. The investigator, a grizzled man who had seen it all, agreed to take the case. Within weeks, he delivered. The reports were damning. Photos, timestamps, receipts, everything pointed to one undeniable fact. Marcus wasn't just having an affair, he was in a full-blown relationship with a younger woman. The private investigator provided a name, Alyssa. She was everything Lydia expected. Blonde, slim, perpetually youthful. She was also Marcus's colleague, a woman from the new branch he'd been so keen to visit during his business trips. Lydia received photos of them together, holding hands as they strolled through a park, laughing over intimate dinners, sharing stolen kisses in the shadows of upscale hotels. Marcus, the man who had once sworn to love only her, was living a life Lydia had never been privy to. Each piece of evidence she collected felt like a knife twisting deeper into her heart. But Lydia didn't allow herself to dwell on the pain. She had a job to do. She compiled everything, emails, text messages, videos, into a file. It became her arsenal, a weapon waiting for the right moment to be unleashed. The psychological game. Lydia didn't just focus on building her financial independence and collecting evidence. She understood that the most devastating blows were those delivered in moments of ultimate vulnerability. And so, she began to play a subtle psychological game, planting seeds of doubt in Marcus's mind without him ever realizing it. It started innocuously enough, little comments about their finances, casual questions about their future. "Do you think we're secure?" Lydia asked one evening as they sat together in the living room, the glow of the fireplace casting flickering shadows on the walls. Marcus glanced at her over the top of his newspaper, barely paying attention. "Of course we are," he said dismissively. "Everything's fine." Lydia nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "I just worry sometimes. It's important to have a safety net, don't you think?" He shrugged. "I handle all of that. You don't need to worry about anything." But she did worry, and Marcus never realized just how much. Every conversation they had about money, every reassurance he gave her, only reinforced her resolve to strip him of every asset he thought was his. He had no idea that while he was busy with Alyssa, Lydia was learning everything she could about their financial landscape and how to dismantle it. Marcus's ignorance played into Lydia's hands beautifully. He never questioned her sudden interest in their finances, nor did he notice when she stopped bringing up his late nights or frequent business trips. He thought her silence meant she was none the wiser, that he had successfully kept his double life hidden. Lydia's silence wasn't born from ignorance. It was strategic. She made sure to return his affection when he showed it, smiling warmly when he kissed her good night, laughing at his jokes during dinner. She played the part of the perfect wife, always attentive, always understanding. But it wasn't love that fueled her actions anymore. It was strategy. The more Marcus believed she was blissfully unaware, the more reckless he became. Sowing seeds of doubt. As Lydia quietly built her wealth and gathered evidence, she also began to subtly manipulate Marcus's sense of control over their life together. She knew Marcus was the type of man who thrived on dominance, who liked to believe he was in charge. Slowly, she started to plant doubts in his mind, gently tugging at the seams of his confidence. "Are you sure we're okay financially?" she asked him again one evening after dinner. "I mean, with all your business trips and expenses, do we have enough saved up?" Marcus, growing impatient, waved her off. "Lydia, stop worrying. I've told you, everything is under control." "I know," she replied, her voice soft. "It's just, I hear stories sometimes about people losing everything overnight. I just want to make sure we're safe." She could see it, the flicker of irritation in his eyes, the slight tension in his jaw. He hated being questioned, especially about things he believed he had full control over. Lydia knew that if she pushed too hard, Marcus might start to suspect something, so she backed off, offering him a reassuring smile. "You're right," she said sweetly. "I trust you." That was the key, letting him think he was still in control. In reality, Lydia was the one pulling the strings, inching closer to her goal with each passing day. The shift in power. As months passed, Lydia continued her careful charade. She remained warm and attentive, never once letting Marcus see the cold calculations behind her eyes. To him, she was still the same devoted wife, the woman he could manipulate without consequence. He had no idea that Lydia had been slowly turning the tables, quietly reclaiming the power he believed he held over her. The longer Marcus remained in the dark, the more confident Lydia became. She was no longer playing defense, reacting to his lies and deceptions. Now, she was on the offensive, always one step ahead. She didn't just want to catch him in the act. She wanted to ruin him, to dismantle the life he had built on lies. And she was almost ready. The pieces were in place. Her wealth had been secured, her evidence gathered, and her plan for the final confrontation was taking shape. All she needed now was the perfect moment to strike. It was only a matter of time before Marcus would discover just how wrong he had been to underestimate her. Chapter 6. Tipping Point. It was a cloudy Wednesday morning when Marcus casually announced he had to leave for another business trip. He stood in the doorway of their bedroom, tugging on his tie as Lydia lay in bed, feigning disinterest. He'd become so predictable, so comfortable in his deceit, that he no longer bothered to explain or justify his frequent absences. "Another trip, huh?" Lydia asked, her tone light, as if she were simply making conversation. She knew exactly what this trip was. Her private investigator had already confirmed it. Marcus and Alyssa were going on a romantic getaway to a secluded beach resort, under the guise of a work trip. They were planning to spend a week indulging in what Marcus thought was their secret relationship. It was anything but. "Yeah," Marcus replied with a slight smile. "Just a couple of meetings, nothing too exciting." He leaned down to kiss her forehead, his lips barely brushing her skin. "I'll be back by the weekend." Lydia smiled up at him, her expression serene. "Have a great trip, darling," she said sweetly. "I'll miss you." He nodded, grabbed his briefcase, and headed for the door. Lydia followed him down the stairs, watching as he opened the front door and stepped out onto the driveway. She waved from the doorway, still smiling as he threw his luggage into the trunk and slid into the driver's seat. As the car pulled away from the house, Lydia's smile faded. She stood there for a moment, watching the taillights disappear down the street, her hands clasped in front of her. This time, there was no sadness or anger, no heartbreak, just a cold, calculated determination. The moment had come. Lydia closed the door with a quiet click and walked into the kitchen. She poured herself a cup of coffee, sat at the breakfast table, and for a moment allowed herself to take in the stillness of the house. This was it, the tipping point she had been waiting for. Marcus, so oblivious, so confident in his lies, had no idea that his life was about to come crashing down around him. She had planned for this moment for months, meticulously ensuring that every piece of the puzzle was in place. Now it was time to execute. She finished her coffee, set the cup down, and walked over to her home office. The space was immaculately organized, reflecting the order and control she had established over her life in the months since she first uncovered Marcus's affair. Lydia sat at her desk, opened her laptop, and methodically began making calls. The legal strike first. She contacted her lawyer. Lydia had chosen one of the best in the business, a woman known for her ruthlessness in high-stakes divorce cases. They had been preparing for this moment for weeks, meticulously combing through every financial document, every asset, and every investment. Lydia's lawyer had ensured that every loophole was closed, every possible countermove Marcus might attempt was anticipated. "I'm ready," Lydia said calmly when her lawyer picked up the phone. "Good," the lawyer replied. "I'll file the papers this afternoon. By the time he returns, everything will be in motion." Lydia leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly. It was a strange feeling, the knowledge that in just a few days, everything would change. But she didn't feel anxious. If anything, she felt powerful, more powerful than she had ever felt before. Marcus thought he had control, but in reality, Lydia had been pulling the strings for months. As she hung up the phone, Lydia opened a folder on her laptop labeled Finances. Inside was a detailed breakdown of every account they owned: joint accounts, investment portfolios, real estate holdings. Lydia had already taken steps to secure what was rightfully hers. Using the trust she had established months ago, she had systematically transferred assets into her name. Their joint savings account? Now under her control. The real estate investments Marcus had so proudly built over the years? Lydia had taken ownership of them too. She had also ensured that Marcus wouldn't be able to touch a single cent from their joint assets. The lawyer had filed a financial injunction, freezing all their accounts the moment the divorce papers were served. Marcus would be locked out of everything. With every transaction, Lydia had taken a step further away from the woman she once was, the wife who had trusted her husband implicitly, the woman who had been content to live in his shadow. Now she was in control, and Marcus would be left with nothing. The final pieces. Next, Lydia contacted the private investigator one last time. "Is he on the flight?" she asked, keeping her voice even. "Yes," the investigator confirmed. "He and Alyssa boarded the plane an hour ago. They'll be in the Caribbean by nightfall." Lydia nodded, her mind already racing ahead. The timing was perfect. Marcus would be thousands of miles away, completely unaware that his life back home was unraveling. He wouldn't even know what hit him. After hanging up, Lydia made another call, this one to a realtor she had been working with. She had found a new place to live, a penthouse apartment in the heart of the city. It was a far cry from the suburban mansion she shared with Marcus, but that was the point. Lydia had no intention of staying in the home they had built together, a home that now felt tainted by his betrayal. "The papers are signed," the realtor said cheerfully. "The place is yours." Lydia smiled for the first time that morning. "Thank you. I'll be moving in by the end of the week." She had one last call to make, this one more personal. She dialed Marcus's parents, who had always adored her and were completely in the dark about their son's infidelity. Lydia had been careful not to let anything slip over the past few months, maintaining the facade of a happy marriage. But that was about to change. "Hello, Joan," Lydia said warmly when Marcus's mother answered. "I wanted to let you know that Marcus and I will be having a little talk when he gets back from his trip. There's something important I need to share with you." She left the details vague, knowing that Joan's curiosity would be piqued. By the time Marcus returned, his parents would be waiting for an explanation, a conversation he would be ill-prepared for. With everything in motion, Lydia stood up from her desk and took a deep breath. The wheels had been set in motion. Marcus's world was crumbling, and he didn't even know it yet. The calm before the storm. The house was quiet that evening. Lydia cooked herself a simple dinner and sat at the dining table alone, savoring the stillness. There was no need to rush, no need to panic. Everything had been arranged. The divorce papers would be filed by morning, the accounts were secured, and soon enough, Marcus would be left with nothing. For months, Lydia had played the role of the silent, unassuming wife, biding her time as Marcus carried on with his affair. But now, the mask was off. She was no longer the woman who had been betrayed. She was the one in control, the one who would emerge victorious. As she sipped her wine, Lydia allowed herself to imagine the moment Marcus returned. He would walk through the front door, expecting the same old routine, only to be met with the harsh reality of his downfall. The papers would be waiting for him, along with the evidence of his affair. His accounts would be frozen, his assets gone, his life dismantled in one swift move. Lydia smiled to herself. It was all falling into place, and Marcus would never see it coming. Chapter 7. The Confrontation. The evening Marcus returned home, the air felt deceptively calm. Lydia had prepared his favorite meal, the smell of roasted lamb and garlic filling the house, as if nothing had changed. She stood by the kitchen counter, pouring herself a glass of wine, her back turned to the door, as she heard the familiar sound of Marcus's car pulling into the driveway. He walked into the house, setting his suitcase down with a soft thud. Lydia turned, greeting him with a warm smile that could have fooled anyone. "Welcome home," she said softly. Marcus's expression brightened. "It's good to be home," he replied, shrugging off his coat and hanging it on the hook by the door. He walked over to her, kissing her on the cheek. "Dinner smells amazing." "I thought you'd like it," Lydia said, her voice smooth and even. She gestured toward the dining table. "Come, sit." They sat across from each other, the flickering candlelight casting soft shadows on the table. Marcus launched into stories from his supposed business trip, recounting long meetings and conference calls. Lydia nodded politely, listening to every fabricated detail as if she hadn't already known where he had truly been, on a beach with Alyssa, sipping cocktails and basking in his own lies. "And then the client. He just couldn't stop talking about this new project we're working on," Marcus continued, cutting into his lamb. It was exhausting, honestly. Lydia smiled, lifting her wineglass to her lips. "Sounds like a productive trip." "Yeah, productive," Marcus echoed, his gaze lingering on her for a moment before shifting back to his plate. He didn't sense a thing. His entire life was about to unravel, and he had no idea. After dinner, Marcus leaned back in his chair, content and full. Lydia watched him closely, taking one last sip of wine before setting her glass down with a soft clink. It was time. I have something for you, she said calmly, standing up and walking to the sideboard. Marcus looked up, surprised. Oh? What is it? Lydia pulled out a large manila envelope from the drawer and returned to the table, setting it in front of him. Her face remained composed, betraying none of the tension that had built inside her over the past months. Marcus frowned, his brow furrowing as he glanced down at the envelope. What's this? Open it, Lydia replied, her voice steady, almost cold. With a hesitant glance in her direction, Marcus picked up the envelope and tore it open. He pulled out the contents, several pages thick, and began flipping through them. His face drained of color as he read the words on the first page, Petition for Divorce. What? Marcus stammered, looking up at Lydia with wide eyes. What is this? But Lydia didn't respond. She simply watched him, waiting for the next part. Marcus's hands trembled as he turned the page. The next section contained photographs. Photos of him and Alyssa at the airport, holding hands as they boarded the plane. Photos of them at the resort, lounging by the pool, laughing together as if they hadn't a care in the world. There were hotel receipts, dinner bills, and screenshots of text messages between them. Every lie, every betrayal, meticulously documented. His voice cracked as he attempted to explain. Lydia, I can explain, She held up a hand, silencing him. There's no need. Marcus's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. He looked down at the damning evidence in front of him, his mind spinning in confusion and fear. But how long have you known? Lydia crossed her arms, leaning back in her chair as she stared him down. Long enough. I've been watching you for months, Marcus. Every time you thought you were being clever, covering your tracks, I was 2 steps ahead. His face contorted with panic as he desperately shuffled through the papers, trying to find some flaw in the mountain of evidence. Lydia, please, we can fix this. We can go to counseling or— There's nothing to fix, Lydia interrupted, her voice hardening. Do you think this is just about the affair? This is about the lies, the deceit, the disrespect, and now you're going to face the consequences. Marcus's gaze flickered toward her, his fear shifting to disbelief. You can't just— I already have, Lydia said coolly, standing up from the table. While you were off with Alyssa, I've been busy. All of our assets, everything we've built together, they're mine now. His eyes widened, disbelief morphing into shock. What? What do you mean? Lydia walked over to the window, staring out at the darkening sky. I've transferred everything, Marcus. The house, the cars, the savings accounts, even your investments. They're all in my name now. You're left with nothing. A sickening realization dawned on Marcus. His voice shook as he whispered, But you can't do this. Lydia turned back to him, her expression icy. I already have, she repeated. You see, Marcus, I've been planning this for a long time. You thought you could cheat and walk away unscathed, but you were wrong. Now you'll lose everything. Marcus rose to his feet, knocking the chair back in his panic. Lydia, please, this is crazy. We can talk about this, we can work something out. There's nothing left to discuss, Lydia said, cutting him off sharply. You made your choices and now you'll have to live with them. I'm done being the fool in this marriage. Tears welled up in Marcus's eyes as the weight of his predicament crashed down on him. He had been so certain that Lydia was oblivious, that she would never find out. He had underestimated her, and now it was too late. Lydia watched him crumble, her heart cold and distant. There was no satisfaction in seeing him like this, no triumphant thrill. It was simply the conclusion of months of careful, deliberate planning. She had outwitted him at every turn, and now there was nothing left for him to hold on to. Please, Lydia, don't do this, Marcus begged, his voice breaking. I'll leave her. I'll do anything. Lydia's expression remained stone-like, unmoved by his desperation. It's too late. She walked to the door, opening it slowly. You should leave now, Marcus. He stood there, frozen, his world crumbling around him. For the first time in their marriage, Marcus had no control. He was powerless, utterly at Lydia's mercy. Without another word, he grabbed his coat, his face pale and defeated. As he stepped out into the cold night air, Lydia closed the door behind him with a finality that left no room for hope. It was done. Lydia turned away from the door, her mind already focusing on the future. Marcus was out of her life, his betrayal stripped bare for all to see. She had taken everything from him, just as he had taken her trust. And now, she was free. The storm had passed. Chapter 8. Exposure. Lydia knew that merely taking Marcus's material wealth wasn't enough. She wanted to ensure that he didn't just lose his possessions. He had to lose everything that made him feel powerful and respected. That's why, after the divorce papers had been delivered and their financial separation secured, she turned to the final phase of her plan: exposure. In the days following their confrontation, while Marcus still struggled to process the divorce and his sudden impoverishment, Lydia was already in motion. She gathered every shred of evidence she had accumulated, the photos, the hotel receipts, the text messages, and carefully packaged it into digital files. Then she crafted the perfect email. The recipients were handpicked: Marcus's colleagues at his firm, his professional network of clients, his boss, his closest friends, and most importantly, his family. Lydia made sure that no one important to Marcus's life would be left unaware of his betrayal. Her tone in the email was cold and professional, devoid of any emotion. She simply laid out the facts: how Marcus had been unfaithful, how he had lied to those closest to him, and how his betrayal had been ongoing for years. She attached the damning evidence, letting the pictures and documents speak for themselves. Lydia knew that once this information was out, there would be no hiding from it. With one click, she sent the email, watching the progress bar complete as the files were distributed across the world of Marcus's social and professional circles. She sat back in her chair, a small, satisfied smile playing on her lips. The fallout was swift. Within hours, Lydia began receiving forwarded messages from friends who had been blind copied on the original email. Marcus's colleagues were stunned, and his family was devastated. His parents, once so proud of their successful son, were now ashamed, sending messages to Lydia expressing their shock and heartbreak. His friends, the ones who had always admired Marcus for his charm and success, distanced themselves from him. The next morning, Marcus arrived at his office, unaware of the storm brewing. He was met with cold stares, hushed whispers, and a meeting with his boss. The firm had built its reputation on integrity, and Marcus's scandal was a black mark they couldn't afford. By the end of the day, he was forced to resign, leaving the office with his personal belongings in a cardboard box. As Marcus walked out of the building, the weight of his public disgrace hit him like a ton of bricks. His career, his reputation, his standing, everything was gone. Chapter 9. Ruined. In the weeks that followed, Marcus's life unraveled with brutal efficiency. He had always prided himself on his connections and status, but now those same people turned their backs on him. His job was gone, and the likelihood of finding a new one in his field was slim. No one wanted to be associated with the man whose personal scandal had become a public spectacle. Marcus's once pristine credit was now ruined, thanks to Lydia's strategic control over their finances. His luxury cars were repossessed, his high-end apartment sold off to cover debts, and he was forced to move into a cramped, dingy studio apartment on the outskirts of town. Even Alyssa, the woman for whom he had risked everything, quickly abandoned him. Once she realized that Marcus no longer had the financial security or professional success that had attracted her, she distanced herself, leaving Marcus alone in his squalid apartment. Her texts became fewer and farther between, until eventually she stopped responding altogether. It was a far cry from the life of luxury Marcus had once enjoyed. He spent his days staring at the walls of his apartment, the sounds of city traffic a constant reminder of how far he had fallen. At night, he would lie awake, the weight of his own failure pressing down on him. His phone, once buzzing with messages and invitations, now remained silent. His former friends were nowhere to be found, his family embarrassed by his actions. The man who had once commanded rooms with his charisma and success was now an outcast, forgotten and humiliated. Chapter 10. Freedom. While Marcus's life descended into ruin, Lydia thrived. With her newfound wealth and independence, she moved to a city far away from the ghosts of her old life. She found a beautiful modern apartment with a balcony overlooking the skyline, a symbol of her fresh start. Lydia had always been skilled as an interior designer, but now, free from the constraints of her marriage, she poured herself into her work. She started her own firm, catering to high-end clients who appreciated her eye for detail and creative flair. Her business quickly grew, and with it, so did her confidence. No longer was she the wife who stood in the shadows of a deceitful husband. Now, she was her own woman, successful, powerful, and in complete control of her life. There were moments when Lydia thought back to Marcus, but they were fleeting, passing like a distant memory. She felt no anger, no sadness, not even satisfaction in what she had done. Instead, there was only a sense of calm, a quiet, resolute knowledge that she had freed herself from the lies and betrayal that had once consumed her life. As she stood on the balcony of her new apartment one evening, a glass of wine in hand, Lydia gazed out at the city below. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden glow across the skyline. It was a moment of peace, a moment she had fought hard to attain. Marcus had thought he could betray her and walk away unscathed, but in the end she had taken everything from him. She had exposed him for what he truly was, and in doing so, she had reclaimed her own life. The perfect revenge wasn't just in destroying Marcus, it was in finding her own strength, her own freedom, and realizing that she had always been capable of so much more. With a final sip of wine, Lydia smiled to herself. She didn't feel an ounce of regret. The perfect revenge was complete.